foreign predatory parasitic corporations are replacing our natural environment with an industrial landscape of wind turbines. One Nation will stand against sending children down a path of drug dependency and body mutilation to appease the gender cult. Leave our kids alone. The Trusted Digital Identity Bill is a global surveillance and control mechanism that profit-hungry corporations and power-mad politicians drafted and crafted. One Nation opposes this inhuman, dystopian future that the United Nations promotes as the Great Reset, and we condemn this Parliament for signing on to it. I called for Australia to reject the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and instead mount a Great Resist. Just like the koalas being euthanized to make way for wind turbines or damaged solar panels leaking toxic heavy metals into waterways, the United Nations net zero plan again involves killing the environment to save it. I've been speaking about the fear, the oppression and the inhuman cruelty of our COVID response since July 2020. I promised to hound down those responsible, and I will continue relentlessly to keep that promise. You're about to be live with me, Senator Malcolm Roberts. Well, good day. It's Friday afternoon, and I've got back into the electorate office after travelling for the last couple of weeks, few weeks in fact. So I'll give you an update in our live stream. We've got a change this week, a change in format. I'm going to try something new that someone in our office has thought of, our office team has thought of, and it involves playing a couple of short video clips and stopping it to ask you questions and make comments. Both the clips are from a media conference with Chris Bowen, the Minister for Misery. He's in charge of, in reality, his title is, I think, Climate Change and Energy. He's making a mess of energy, completely destroying the energy sector. And when I bring you up to date with the forums around the regions, I'll tell you more about that. Now, this media conference or media gathering was around about May, I think, introducing legislation controlling the cars that you can choose and that will raise the prices of petrol and diesel vehicles to take them off the market and then bring in EVs. That's what this is all about. It's an attack on petrol and diesel vehicles, your cars, our cars, wrapped up as an efficiency measure to improve. And it's also wrapped up in terms of giving you choice when it'll actually restrict choice. Now, the efficiency standards, we think, are based on carbon dioxide output, because that's roughly the same as fuel consumption. The more fuel you chew, the more carbon dioxide you produce. Oh, and just look for something very, very interesting. Carbon dioxide comes into our noses, into our lungs, at 0.04% of the atmosphere. It goes out of our lungs at 4 to 5%, which is 100 to 125 times the level. So you and I are making carbon dioxide. Every koala is making carbon dioxide. And so let's see if he's going to tackle carbon dioxide output from humans or just from cars. Now, another thing to look for is to see if you can find any data at all as mentioned as the basis for policy. I couldn't. And if you want to giggle, watch the other man's eyes. There's another man on stage. I think he's a Toyota executive. But watch his eyes and his expression. Anyway, let's get on with the videos. And bear with me as I try to...
But long overdue. Been promised by governments for decades, but this government will be the government that delivers it. And as Catherine said, we are joined today by a broad cross-section of the motoring industry. And just as a broad cross-section of the motoring industry has engaged with us, it's now time, ideally, for a broad cross-section of the Parliament to pass this legislation. This legislation will mean Australian motorists are no longer at the back of the queue.
He just said a broad cross-section. Later on in the media conference video, he talks about two companies that are there: Toyota, which makes hybrids, and Tesla, which makes exclusively electric vehicles, which are not the 98%, more than 98% of cars that are bought by Australians, petrol and diesel. He's talking about two select elite companies with him. And notice how he's talking about a broad cross-section? Well, it's rubbish. It's a tiny minority of sales, around 1 to 2% of the market. Now let's continue with him talking about going to the back of the queue.
no longer treated as second-class citizens.
I missed that bit because I overshot the first one. But he talked about Australian motorists, you and I, being at the back of the queue.
But given the same rights as those motorists and consumers in 85% of the world's car markets. And no longer will Australia be in the G2 of...
So he's talking about giving us rights. He's actually reducing worsening our cost of living, reducing our standard of living, because what his measure will do is increase the price of petrol and diesel cars, the overwhelming majority of cars bought in the market. When he talks about going to the back of the queue, what bloody queue? There is no queue for destruction. The only queue for destruction you could think about possibly is the queue of Western countries that are lining up to commit suicide with the United Nations and World Economic Forum policies. What he's doing is he's telling a lie, a white lie in this case, the back of the queue. And he's promising to give us rights. He's dressing this up, but no matter which way you dress up bullshit, it's still bullshit. And the US had to back down, we believe, on their version of the carbon dioxide standards. And, you know, this is a cost of living crisis that we're in, and he's removing options that are helpful. And he's portraying that as helpful and better. He's removing options and saying that it's helpful and better. How is removing options better for us? How is spending more money on the same product better for us? And then he just talked about the G2. He had a sarcastic little quip about Russia being with Australia by association. He's smearing us. So let's listen to the rest of what he says about Russia and Australia.
Australia and Russia as the only two major economies without vehicle efficiency standards. Now, as Catherine said, we announced our...
Vladimir Putin, for all you think of him, stands up for Russia. And many years ago, there was a story, I won't go into the details now, I'm happy to tell it. It's a funny story about the British who went to, with their climate experts, went to Russia to deal with the Russian Scientific Academy. Putin made a funny quip about that because the British were told and sent packing. Actually, they ran out of the room because the Russian scientists actually told them about the reality of climate science. But Putin, I think it was the UN Kyoto Protocol. I'm not sure about the UN agreement specifically. I think it was about Kyoto. Putin was going to tell the UN to go to hell, along with China and the others. And then he suddenly realized they could make a lot of money out of it. I think because they were shutting down old factories, as it was, they were going to get paid to shut down those factories. And he realized Russia would get $4 billion. So he joined the UN Kyoto Protocol to get money. So they know, the Russians are smart enough to know, they're very good scientists, they're smart enough to know that this is rubbish.
Preferred model in February. We said we'd consult with parties of good faith on implementation details, on finer details. We said we'd take on board sensible good faith suggestions, and that's exactly what we've done. Not everybody here has got everything they've asked for. Some people wanted us to go.
He says everybody had a say. Oh, really, Chris? Everyday Australians were not asked. Do you want to be forced out of the cars you love, the petrol and diesel cars you need, the four-wheel drives that you want for touring around the country, going bush, the vehicles that you need for towing? Do you really need that? Yeah, Max Power, I can see. You'll just stick with your 2002 Hilux diesel ute. Thank you very much. Good on you, Max. That's exactly what I would do. Do you really want to be forced out of the cars that you love? No, but you weren't asked. But you're given rights and you're given an access to the standards. So let's continue with Misery Minister.
Harder and faster. Some had concerns and wanted us to slow. But everybody here today has had a say. Everybody today has had genuine concerns taken on board.
Look at the man in the back.
And everyone today recognises that Australia can now move on, implement these standards, and Australian motorists can get access to these standards. In addition to the changes, Catherine...
Australian motorists get access to the standards, presented as beneficial. What a wonderful gift. It's going to cost you more money. This man is just nuts or dishonest. I think it's a bit of both. I think it's a large dosage of both. This is what's happened with the entire climate fraud, the entire climate scam, that's been going on now since Maurice Strong from the United Nations introduced it back in the early 80s. Yes, last independent thinker, let the market decide. I agree with you entirely. So let's go on to his next bit of joy coming our way.
Announced in my portfolio, I'm also announcing $60 million of support for Australian car dealers on charging. We recognise, not just in terms of Australian car dealers making...
So he's promising $60 million of taxpayer money, your money, my money, to car dealers to build charging stations. Meanwhile, oh, you can't make this up, as Hoodie would say. You just can't make this stuff up. Premier Stephen Miles in Queensland is getting absolutely torn to shreds for his petrol station idea, his petrol station nightmare. And yet Bowen gets away with his mad claim for EV charging stations, government-funded charging stations. Now, Premier Miles has got smashed because he has done no modelling. He refused to say there's modelling. 3 times the reporter I saw asked him, where's the modelling? And 3 times he gave an answer that had nothing to do with it. There's no cost-benefit analysis, no business case. Same applies to Chris Bowen's charging stations. They seem to forget that EVs, in Stephen Miles's case, EVs are being subsidised by the Labor government to increase sales of EVs and drive out petrol and diesel. So Miles wants to bring in petrol stations owned by the government. This guy's a lunatic. And similar kind of thinking going on with Bowen. This is your minister wasting your money. Wayne Montgomery says, wow, taxpayers are paying for the vehicles nobody wants or needs. So you can see sometimes, as much as I get frustrated in Canberra and sometimes a little bit angry, and as much as I describe Canberra as swimming in treacle, it is quite funny. Yes, Dennis, Miles is just saying and doing things to get elected. But people have woken up. People have absolutely woken up. That, we'll talk more about Miles later. The ACTU ran petrol stations under when Bob Hawke was president of the secretary or president of the ACTU back in the late 70s, I think it was. I remember they bought Burke's department store in Melbourne and they went into the petrol business, petrol station business, and it failed. It just failed catastrophically. Now you've got to ask yourself. Well, let's continue listening to Bowen now that I've got over my histrionics with Miles.
In a very big transition to EVs and hybrids, having chargers available to charge the cars in their stock, but also being able to provide a charging option for their customers going forward after purchase is a good thing. And that $60 million will be available in a competitive process, and of course will encourage and have weighting towards those dealers that make the charging available to consumers and motorists more broadly. But it's great to be joined by this broad cross...
So, if it's such a wonderful thing, why aren't the car dealers doing it? If they're expecting massive sales on EVs, why aren't they building charging stations? And why, forget the car dealers for a minute, why isn't some other entrepreneur building charging stations at the dealerships? If this is going to be a massive transition to EVs, wouldn't someone want to get in on it and charge money for charging electric vehicles? The masses of electric vehicles we're going to get? This is just insane. So what they need are charging stations to get more people to be enticed into EVs, but no one's willing to do it because they can't see that the benefit of EVs overall, apart from a very small number who will get benefit from EVs, inner city residents potentially, but then they'll have to buy 2 cars because they won't have one suitable for going long distance. So car dealers are making the transition to EVs not because of sales, not because of profit, but because the government is enticing them, forcing them with subsidies. So we wonder how long it'll be before we started seeing quotas. Just like they've got quotas on solar and wind, generated power, they may put quotas on EVs. So I don't think they're quite game enough to do that yet. But the transition to EVs, with the reason we're seeing EVs in showrooms, not so many on the street, is because the government is enticing and forcing them. So if this goes ahead, this charging stations at the dealerships, if this goes ahead, we'll see EVs able to go from the dealers to home. That's assuming you've got the few $1,000s you can invest in putting a home charging station in place. Come for a drive in the country into the regions and see how far you'll get. And remember, this is taxpayer money. It's not government money. And watch, did you note Bowen's dismissive hands? It was just a mere offhand comment. What Bowen is doing is he's showing the way the Uni Party works in governance in this country. They ply on ignorance. Not a single fact, not a single piece of data for the basis of his policy. Not a single piece of data. And on this basis, no cost-benefit analysis, no business case, and on this basis, he's putting in place a policy that will cost you and I a lot of money. And in higher petrol and diesel car prices, it will have no benefit for the environment. And what you can see is the way governance in the Uni Party works, because it's not just Labor that does this. This is the Liberals also doing it, the Liberal Nationals. Every major climate and energy policy has been introduced by the Liberal National Party, starting with John Howard. And so what they do is they ply on ignorance. They ply on lies, claiming there's a climate catastrophe imminent. And we've been told that it's coming in 5 years' time. We've been told that for 44 years now. But they ply on ignorance. They beat up ignorance, and they dumb down the people. So I'm pleased to see the comments coming through. This is so many people are awake in One Nation and on our Facebook, YouTube. Okay, then the next comment he makes is a broad cross-section.
Section of the motoring industry to be joined by Tesla and Toyota. It reminds me of when the Prime Minister and I notified the UNFCCC of our...
Two car makers now make up a broad cross-section. One of them makes only EVs. Only EVs. That's Tesla, of course. And the other one makes hybrids. And full marks to Toyota. They could see the pressure coming, and they decided to do something about it, so they went into hybrids. They weren't the first to launch a hybrid in the American market. That was Honda. But Honda didn't fully commit to hybrids, because even though they were the first in the largest market in the world at the time, because the efficiency of a hybrid is not there overall. For most Australians, it takes far too many miles to recover the cost of the hybrid battery, the drivetrain, and the motors. So I'm told that hybrids are wonderful for city cars, where you get a lot of regenerative braking, or generating electricity when you brake, which is wonderful. And that's clever. But when you're in the country, when you're on the open road, when you're in the outer suburbs, you're dragging around an extra battery and an extra motor and part of the drivetrain, an extra load, which detracts from efficiency. So if you've got a car, if you've got a need for a car in the city with a lot of braking, good luck to you. A hybrid will pay off. But if you're outside, then do the calculations on the fuel economy savings, which will be minimal, and how long it'll take to get that back, and to see if it's worth the extra price you pay for a hybrid, because hybrids cost much more money than their equivalent without the hybrid. But hybrids have got some benefits in certain applications. EVs, Get Smart says, what about towing a caravan? Well, hybrids, I think, can tow caravans, unless their non-hybrid part is too weak. But EVs, you're right, mate, hopeless at towing, because the range drops dramatically when they're towing. I mean, really alarmingly when it's driving. But let's see where Chris Bowen goes next, the Minister for Misery goes next, because he's about to mention something that won't surprise some people. It will surprise others.
43% emissions reduction target, with the Business Council of Australia and the ACTU behind us, with the conservation movement behind us, as well as industry groups, ideally for a broad cross-section of the Parliament to pass this legislation. This legislation...
I'll see if I can
Mr. and I notified the UNFCCC of our 43% emissions reduction target, with the Business Council of Australia and the ACTU behind us, with the...
Did you hear what he just said there? He and the Prime Minister have notified the UNFCCC of the 43% of the Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese's 43% carbon dioxide reduction target. Two things. Carbon dioxide comes from agriculture. Carbon dioxide comes from cars. Carbon dioxide comes from trucks. Carbon dioxide comes from factories. Carbon dioxide comes from power stations. Carbon dioxide comes from making wind and solar generators. And in fact, over the life of a wind turbine and a solar panel, some people say scientifically that there's more carbon dioxide produced over the life of a wind and solar because of the huge amount of energy needed to produce these things than is saved. So carbon dioxide increases due to solar and wind. But what they're saying is a 43% carbon dioxide reduction target. Where else are they going to go? They've said agriculture, which will affect our food. They've said our transport. They've said our power, which is now driving up power costs enormously. We've gone from the cheapest in the world to among the most expensive. But the other thing I want you to see and to hear is UNFCCC. What's that? Some people say. UNFCCC, just dismissed it off to the side. That's the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change. I've been watching these people since 2007 when I first started getting into researching the climate scam, the climate fraud. United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They oversee the corrupt, crooked, incompetent, dishonest United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which pretends to be a scientific body, but it's not. It's a political instrument. Christiana Figueres was, I think, the previous. I remember a few years ago listening to her. She said that the climate change, what would you call it? Climate change campaign from the United Nations is about a new economic order. It's using a pseudo-environment point to bring in place a new economic order. The second point about this is what the hell is an Australian Prime Minister and an Australian Minister in Chris Bowen doing satisfying foreign orders? This is confirmation out of his own mouth that he's doing something to satisfy foreign orders, not in Australia's interests. Chris Bowen is an Australian minister. Why is he not taking care of Australians? Why is he working against Australians? Why? Why have the Uni Party, the Liberal Nationals and the Labor Party, why have they been working against Australians since 1996 when John Howard came to power and introduced the renewable energy target, the national electricity market, stole farmers' property rights to comply with the UN's Kyoto Protocol? He said we would comply with the UN's Kyoto Protocol. He said we wouldn't sign it, but we will comply with it. That is what's happening under the Uni Party. Liberal Labor pushing a UN. Someone's saying there. Bev Eels is saying reduce people. That's one of the very good answers, because they're going to reduce standards of living dramatically. The birth rates will plummet, and so that is. I can see. Yeah, there's so many comments. Albo is a traitor. We need carbon. Like we need, what have we got there? Like we need oxygen. Exactly. Carbon dioxide is essential for all life on this planet. I'll say it again. Carbon dioxide is essential for all life on this planet. There's 0.04% in the atmosphere. It doesn't fluctuate as humans increase or decrease our levels of our production of carbon dioxide. Bowen wants everyone to get around on rollerblades. As human production of carbon dioxide increases and decreases, the level in the atmosphere doesn't change. We've seen that, and I'll talk about that again in the future. Let's move on to the next clip. You see how they answer questions.
Has been with demand not being where it was expected, even with things like subsidies to entice people into electric vehicles. Has the government done any modelling on how you're expecting demand for these vehicles to change in Australia as these cuts come in, and what does it say?
I'll just say this, Claire.
A lady journalist, presumably, has asked about demand. She said it's softened even further. And we know it's softened even further in the last couple of months around the world since that question was asked. Demand is not where it's expected. even with subsidies, she says. And then she says very clearly, what does the modelling say? And what does the reduction in demand say? And he says, here we go, we'll listen to Chris, Minister for Misery himself.
EV demand is very high across the world. I read some stories to the contrary, but EV demand remains very strong.
There's one word that describes that, lie. That is a lie.
This is not just about EVs, it's also about hybrids and more efficient petrol and diesel.
Change the topic quickly.
Diesel vehicles, as Catherine and I have consistently said for a long period of time. And the Peak Industry Group, in their submission to us, said that they expect a big increase in EVs to be brought to Australia under business as usual. And what we've sought to do is...
So he did say, if you remember, that he admits that there are contrary stories that say demand is low, certainly not as high as expected. Data's data. Why doesn't he just produce the data to show us the expected forecasts compared with the reality? The reality is very much lower. We see, and then he talks about other groups expect a big increase in EVs. Some manufacturers, car manufacturers, that said they would be converting entirely to EVs are now shutting down EV production, or at least curtailing production. Ford is one that's lost billions of dollars on EVs. Tesla's now under pressure. So let's keep going.
Is ensure that we require Australian motorists to have choice. Now, no, we haven't. We don't have a target for EV take-up. We believe Australians have choices, and they should be given better choices. Yep.
Minister, though.
Require choice. We're going to force choice on you. Oh, really? That seems to be an oxymoron, doesn't it? Require choice. So no modelling has been assumed. The questions were not answered. He didn't talk about the modelling. And what we're seeing is car manufacturers that appeased government forecasts, projections, dreams, nightmares, now in a mess. So now we're going to have a question about USA demand. You look at what he does. I would... Immune 2PR says, I wouldn't let Bowen charge my TV remote batteries. No, neither would I. Okay, here we go.
The US targets that we're seeking to align to, Biden explicitly says we want about half of new car sales by 2030.
And that's what the FCA said they expected to happen.
Sure.
Jacob.
Boom, boom, boom. Avoided the question. Boom, boom, boom. That's it. Get on with it.
How many EVs do you think will make up the market by the end of this 2030? And secondly, what's your message at this point to the Greens on this, given they've indicated that this is kind of hostage to the gas?
Well, the answer to the first question, Jacob, is that's up to Australian motorists. We are not providing a target or a mandate. Some manufacturers are making their choices about when they'll stop making internal combustion engines, and some other countries are going down that road, but we're not. I believe in choices. And the number of people who say to me, I want my next car to be an EV or a hybrid, but I don't feel there's a range at the moment, this is what's designed to deal with that. Now, in relation to the second question, this has been a reform in the too-hard basket for 20 years.
So let's look at what he just said in answer to the question about forecast size of electric vehicle market. Failed to answer it. Just flat out failed. No modelling's been done. Manufacturers are saying, some are saying, when they will end petrol and diesel. Toyota has now plucked up the courage to say it won't be ending petrol and diesel. It won't be. Most of the manufacturers went along with this rubbish because they were afraid to tackle the government. Might be government purchases of their cars for the government fleet, or it might be just that they were afraid of getting falling foul of government. But Toyota now has said openly that it won't be getting rid of petrol and diesel. Honda has a track record. Yeah, hang on, let me get to this. Who is that behind Bowen? This is from Nita. That's the man I said, I think he's one of the Toyota executives. The look on his face says it all, even he's embarrassed by Bowen's life. That's the point I was getting to when I said, watch this man's face at the start of this live stream. Where were we? Honda has always been one that's very, very, one of the most admired companies in the world. I really have very high regard for Honda. Their valuing of the environment is it's totally honest. and it's right up there. But efficiency is really strong. The way they look after their people is very encouraging, very humane, very respectful, and they're very, very efficient. They lead the world in so many things that they do. They're a remarkable company. But they haven't had the guts to come out and say these things to the governments around the world, and they've been silent. But anyway, at least Toyota has now said that it won't be getting rid of petrol and diesel. Bowen says that people are telling him there's a lack of EV models in Australia. EVs can't make off-road four-wheel drives. There's nowhere to refuel them. When the going gets tough, EV consumption of charge increases dramatically. You can't tow with an EV. A lot of people want towing vehicles, caravans, trailers, horse floats. There's just no understanding of what's going on. It's just glib lies straight over the top. People saying there are a lack of hybrids in Australia, according to Chris Bowen. Almost all models in this country have a hybrid version. The fashion has said that. So what we've got then, he talks about catchy phrases. It's always been in the too hard basket. We're moving it onto the to-do list. Sounds good, doesn't it? But it's bullshit. That's all it is. It's bullshit. So let's continue. He's going to answer the part about the Greens. He's got a message to the Greens, I hope.
We've put it on the to-do list. We'll be putting it to the Parliament. I don't want to speak for climate groups, but we've been liaising with climate groups and consulting with climate groups, and they strongly support this being legislated. And I would think it would be surprising if the Greens stood in the way of what is important climate-related legislation, as well as legislation which brings better choices for Australians.
Challenge in places like the US.
So there we have it. Nothing specific to the Greens. But he's liaising with climate groups, and you see that's what happens. They're afraid to turn away these powerful groups because these powerful groups have the media and have the money. Billionaires like Simon Holmes à Court pushing nonsense about climate. And Simon Holmes à Court's a billionaire getting subsidies for wind turbines and solar panels. You can see the conflicts of interest there. They're abundantly clear. But he's liaising with climate groups. Did you elect the climate groups? I didn't. Did you elect the UNFCCC? I didn't. Notice that nowhere in this whole section on important policies with significant impacts on the Australian people, nowhere does he cite figures, data, business case, cost-benefit analysis, various policy options that he considered. All they're doing is following the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Your minister. This is what happens in the Uni Party. Liberal and Labor, both the same. Every major climate and energy policy was introduced by the Liberals. Then when the Labor Party gets in, they ramp it up. Then the Liberals come in, they introduce more policies. Then the Labor comes in, they ramp it up. Safeguard mechanism was a big headline getter for Bowen and Albanese in September, just after they got in, September 2022. But it built on the safeguard mechanism that Greg Hunt, Liberal Minister for Climate Change and Energy at the time, and Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, introduced quietly through the Senate before I got in the Senate in 2015, last few days before Christmas break. Greg Hunt, in 2000 and 2001, was the World Economic Forum's Manager for Strategy. There you go. That's where it starts. And the whole thing really started with John Howard. I thought he was a very good Prime Minister, and then I started doing my research. And all of this, he put in the basis of what's destroying our electricity sector right now, the fundamental basics he put in there. He also stole farmers' property rights. His government stole farmers' property rights. And then 6 years after he got the boot in 2007, he spent 11 years destroying our country, the energy sector. 6 years later, after he left, in 2013 in London, he delivered a major speech. And he said, on the topic of climate science, I am agnostic. He didn't have the science. This has never been about the science. And then I asked you a question at the start of this session. And that was, does he mention the carbon dioxide in exhaled air? Because, as I said, when we take in air, we take it in containing 0.04% carbon dioxide. When we exhale it, it's 4 to 5%, 100 to 125 times higher than what we breathed in. So we're actually producing and exhaling carbon dioxide. And, you know, I was being funny when I asked you to see if he would mention it. I knew he wouldn't. But I went to a conference here in Brisbane back in the 2010s, around there, and there was a consultant giving a lecture to us at the conference. It was in Brisbane, in the city, and he said that he had been also, he was working on the carbon dioxide emissions trading scheme in Britain, developing it, and Tony Blair asked him to think about, now what was it called, measuring individual exhalations of carbon dioxide. So they put a carbon dioxide tax on individuals. No joke. That's what happened. But I'm going to read you something else. The United Nations wants to keep Australia in the Paris Agreement because developed nations are being called on to finance developing nations. China is a developing nation, so we're going to pay China money. And compensate for past emissions and damage. Damage? Have you seen any damage due to climate? There's no damage due to climate. It's a UN revenue raising, so it can be independent for its budget annually. At the moment, it relies upon donations, grants, fees, levies from individual countries, and only some of them pay. This is about a uni-party sellout of Australia, Australian taxpayers and Australian industry and Australian employers and employees, Australian workers and Australian farmers, sending money to the UN, trillions of dollars worth of it. Now, the Nature journal, which is supposedly a scientific journal, it's lost its reputation over COVID, over climate science. Nature journal study said rich countries like Australia, we rich, are we, would owe middle-income countries like China an estimated $100 to $200 trillion by 2050. Australia's share of that $100 to $200 trillion, according to Nature, is, in US dollars terms, $5 to $10 trillion. It goes on to say the UN wants a 5% sales tax on technology, fashion and defence firms, plus a tax on hydrocarbon fuels, that's coal, oil and natural gas. Just a few months ago, Tanya Plibersek introduced the notion that she'll have a fashion tax because they believe we are using too many clothes or buying too many clothes and not using them enough. They want us to buy fewer clothes, so they'll tax them, get revenue. This is where this rubbish is taking us. Control over every aspect of our lives, including food, by taxing agriculture and limiting agricultural carbon dioxide production. Dale Jackson says in the comments, legislate, regulate, subjugate, and I missed that one. That was excellent. Sounds like serfdom. Yes, Rocket Boity, it does. Stormhawk says, we are one of the most energy-rich countries, and yet we have the most expensive electricity, gas, and oil. We are the third largest exporter of natural gas. We are the second largest exporter of coal. Indonesia has now taken over as the largest exporter. So we are the largest, when you combine them, we're the largest exporters of hydrocarbon fuels, coal, oil and natural gas. But we can't use it here. The United States, under Joe Biden, was supposed to be closing down on carbon dioxide. It has now become the largest exporter of natural gas. I mean, there are just so many lies going on. Lab meat, yummo. Get smart. I thought you were on our side. Yeah. Yeah, that inappropriate for a government approach on our privacy and rights. World Economic Forum recommended washing clothes once every 2 weeks. Yep, they did. Still driving my 28-year-old 96 XR6 Falcon, which I've had for just over 19 years. Good on you, mate. Get out of the UN. That's what I suggested in my very first speech in the Senate in 2016, Neil. Get out of the UN. I called it Niall's exit. to play on the Brexit. Oz exit, Australia out of the UN. And we can do it. It take some doing, but we can do it. Australia, bring back Australian dreams. Help me help Australians. Exactly. Damien says, I don't think I could handle another 4 years of the uni party. Well, you know how to vote. You vote One Nation One, then the other minor parties, freedom parties, free thinking parties, then you vote for the sensible independents, then you vote for the commie independents, then you vote for, in preferences, the Liberal Party, Labor Party, and then dead last, second last, we've got a new one. Second last is the Teals, and last, completely last, are the Greens. The World Economic Forum recommends we eat bugs, live in the pod, own nothing, be happy. Yep, perfect recipe for happiness. Take away freedoms. Vicky says, our country now is a joke. The government has been selling us off for years. Albo has destroyed this country. It's only going to get worse. The only thing I disagree with you there, Vicky, is that Albo hasn't destroyed this country. He's continuing to destroy this country. I was a very big fan of John Howard's at the time, so I'm happy to admit my mistake. I now recognise that he was a terrible Prime Minister. The things I've developed a list of things. Viv Forbes, who's a 84-year-old, 85 actually, he's sharp as a tack. He's been very active supporter of freedom all his adult life. So that's 64 years he's been supporting freedom. I mentioned a couple of things that I was surprised John Howard did, and Viv doesn't take anyone's word for anything. He just doesn't, and he doesn't give advice. He goes and researches, and he came back in a newsletter, which goes around the world. His newsletter goes around the world, and he said, "I'm going to rank the governments in Australia from best to worst." And he said, "That's correct, Australian Conservative. The LNP and Labor have destroyed this country." That is absolutely correct. Because it's not the UN and World Economic Forum that's been pushing policies on us for 80 years. It's the LNP and Labor governments that have taken those policies and put them into practice. Anyway, Viv Forbes listed the governments, and he said some of these governments, and he listed them, have been pretty benign, hopeless sort of things. They didn't do much damage. Good. Then he said some of the others did a moderate amount of damage. Terrible. Then he said the fourth worst government was Gough Whitlam's Labor government. The third worst was Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard's combined mess and charades and fiasco. So you're thinking, who the hell would be second and first worst? Second worst, Malcolm Turnbull, according to Viv, because of the policies they snuck in. I've given you an example of one of them. The other one, the one that's easily the worst, this is from Viv Forbes, easily the worst, the LNP government led by John Howard as Prime Minister. So many things. Okay, let's give an update on, because the people are still wonderful in Australia. We're dumbing people, the governments are dumbing people down because of the bloody national curriculum that guess who introduced? John Howard introduced, and now takes its lead from the United Nations. But despite the dumbing down, the indoctrination, the decimation of families, we still have very, very good people in Australia. And so I was out and about in the last few weeks at forums and evenings at various parts of Queensland, and it's so refreshing to see people actually waking up. But just in the last 2 weeks, I've been to forums at Kilcoy, Yeppoon, Rocky, and then Mackay, Cannon Vale, which is Early Beach, Bowen, Gosford. See, I went down to New South Wales and dared to show my face after being beaten after our state, Queensland, was being beaten in the our state of origin. Where was I going? Oh, then went to Lytton last night, and I'm going to Clayfield tonight. So Clayfield, Michelle Wilde is our candidate there, is hosting a forum on the crime crisis. All the functions we usually have the candidate and then myself give a talk, and then we open up to Q&A. and it's I love Q&A. Absolutely love Q&A. And it's just a way to connect with people really well and to understand and to reveal more of the facts that are of direct interest to people. So we'll be doing that tonight, brief presentations or maybe longer presentations, and then Q&A. And then after the Q&A sessions, we found it very helpful to just hang around for a while, maybe get a bite to eat, and people come up one-on-one and we just talk about personal things, confidential things, stories people want to tell us, things that they want to get in touch with us about. So that's tonight in Clayfield. Not long before all of them, that we were up in Atherton, Cairns. What was the other town we went to up there? Anyway, Townsville, that's right. Tonight at 8:02 or 8:32, I think it is. I can't remember which one. But Michael Griffith is starting his epic podcast. It's a continuous podcast for 24 hours. He's got people from all over the world taking part in it. Hoodie will be there. Hoodie's got a session, I think, 5:30 tomorrow on Saturday for an hour. Hoodie and John, wonderful couple, those two guys. They're really good podcasts. But anyway, I'll be on at 9:30. I think it'll be about half an hour. So I'll have to squeeze that in straight after the forum. So, okay, let's go. We've got about 15 minutes left. I'll open up to Q&A. Scott France, pushing the EV market to secure their investments in the EV industry, bloating and inflating profits due to cash injections from the people's money to support and bolster the EV market. There are many, many parasites, Scott. You're absolutely correct. There are many, many parasites in the world and in Australia. We've got parasitic behaviours from billionaires taking subsidies from you and I for solar and wind. Simon Holmes at Court is taking those parasitic subsidies. Mike Cannon-Brooks. Oh, but here's a change of heart, a realisation. Twiggy Forrest was lining up for billions of dollars and was promised billions of dollars by the governments for green hydrogen. Green hydrogen. It doesn't exist. And he went hell for leather into that. He went overseas, lined up deals. And just recently, in the last few weeks, he said, whoops, I'm going to suspend that for a little bit because it's not what it's cracked up to be. So there's one guy who may have woken up. Any more questions? Zolberg. People need to understand how preferential voting works and place Liberal, Labor and the Greens last on every ballot and ignore the how to vote cards. I agree. People still ask me, how is One Nation going to preference? We don't preference. We make recommendations based upon the individual candidates, and they vary from state to state. They vary from electorate to electorate. But we make recommendations. That's all they are, the recommendations. You can put it in the bin. You can refuse to take it. A lot of people now are refusing to take how to vote cards, and they're doing their research on the net and coming in and voting. But each voter owns their preferences. Each voter owns their preferences, and they allocate them. So the way I vote, I go One Nation 1, I go IMOP 2, Libertarians 3, Family First 4, if it's on the ballot, Catters. So I mix the small ones according to the candidate in the electorate. Who else? Libertarians, IMOP, Catters. Oh, UAP, if it still exists. I'm not sure about that. And then I go through the independents and see if any of them need to be moved up or down. Then I will G-man, and then I put the rat bag. Then I put the rat bag independents, and sometimes you get one. Then I put the Liberal Party. Then I put the Labor Party, and then I put the Teals. Then I put the Greens. Now I've never had to vote for the Teals, but that's the way I will be doing it this time if there's a Teal. Yes, Mitch, Joel Jamal does great how to vote cards. He does his research on individual candidates, not just parties. The reason I put Liberals before Labor is that John Howard changed the policy on filling out the ballot paper, and he forced people to fill out all the boxes with a unique number. So that means you've got to give Labor and Liberal different numbers. So I put the Liberal Party ahead of Labor for one simple reason. Their policies are almost the same. So it's one reason. No one in the Labor Party stands up. No one. Many have told me personally they agree with my stance on climate, they agree with my stance on energy, but they won't stand up. They know that the policies that they're pushing hurt workers, and the Labor Party used to be for workers, but these people who are decent members of the Senate will not speak up. In the Liberal Party, there are some politicians who will stand up. They're very, very few, and they don't stand up on every issue that they want to stand up on, but nonetheless, they do stand up on some issues. Sadly, in the Liberal Party, most of the good ones have been kicked out. Craig Kelly, kicked out or left in disgust. Craig Kelly, George Christensen. Craig left, George left. Kevin Andrews was kicked out. Connie Fierravanti Wells was kicked out. There's another one who was kicked out. Jared Rennick's been demoted. Mr. Rennick, I don't know what he's doing. I like Jared. He's a good man, and he's right beside us on climate. He's right beside us on COVID. He's right beside us on free enterprise. He's right beside us on property rights. He's right there. He knows what he's doing, and he's honest and he's smart. So that's why I put the Liberal Party ahead of the Labor Party. But at the last election, I've got to confess that I put the Labor Party in my electorate of Ryan ahead of the Liberal Party for one simple reason. Julian Simmons was the Liberal Party Member of Parliament in Federal Parliament. Now, I wrote him a letter, detailed letter, with lots of facts in an attachment, and I simply asked one question: I'd like a meeting with you to discuss climate. Didn't even have the courtesy to reply. Now, I know people get busy, but when a senator in your own electorate writes to you, you think that at least there'd be some acknowledgement. If he's not going to acknowledge me, Joe and Mary in the electorate are not going to get a reply. So I actually put him behind the Labor Party because I thought, I don't know the Labor Party candidate, but at least maybe she will reply. Maybe she'll get off her ass and do something. But I put the Greens last. So don't worry about that. This is terrible, Beverly, but I'll answer your question. Please don't do what Beverly is asking. Malcolm, what would happen if everybody in Australia wrote across the form, vote of no confidence? What would happen? You would hand the election entirely to Labor, Liberal, Uni Party. The more people who vote invalid, the more people who don't vote, just hand the election to Labor and Liberal, the Uni Party. You would continue with the Uni Party. You would entrench the Uni Party. It's very, very important to vote. It's very, very important to vote for anyone other than the Uni Party, preferably One Nation at the top, other minor parties in the preferences, and then Liberal, Labor, Teals, Greens. Very important to vote. What can young Aussies do to help One Nation's campaign? You can join the party. You can support the party with donations. But more importantly, or just as important, but if you don't want to do that, then you can support the candidate. You can hand out how to vote cards at the voting booths in pre-poll, especially pre-poll. The Liberal Party and Labor Party actually pay people. The CFMEU, the ETU have paid helpers. They're not volunteers, they're paid to hand out vote cards. So we need more volunteers than the others to cover that, because 2 weeks or maybe even 3 weeks of pre-poll is a lot of time to cover. We have some people who just stay there the whole 3 weeks. It's amazing, the dedication. So you can scrutineer afterwards. You can go door knocking with the candidate, or do door knocking to help the candidate in a different area. You can also share my videos, share Pauline's videos, share our speeches, share our materials. And the biggest thing of all you can do is talk to your friends, your family, your workmates, your sports mates, your social mates, people in the pub. You can talk to them about One Nation policies and what the hell is going on with our country. The biggest thing you can do is to wake people up. Once people are awake to the Uni Party, then they automatically come and vote for One Nation, or vote for one of the other parties and put One Nation high up in the preferences. So that's the other thing. Just vote and get the vote One Nation 1, and put the other minor parties 2, 3, 4, 5. So I hope that's given you an answer. Do you believe the Royal Commission into Veteran Suicide will hold them accountable? I think it will. We had to make an amendment. No, that was another Royal Commission. I'm hoping it will, but I'll wait for the results to come out, and then I'll talk to a couple of the other senators, and above all, I'll talk to some veterans who are keeping an eye on it. We know that there's been some intimidation. And by the way, I got a motion up successfully in the Senate. We've got an inquiry into the medal awarding system in the country, in the Defence Forces, because what we're finding is that high brass are nominating each other. It's like medals are an expectation like salary, and they're downgrading the enlisted men and women who have been nominated. I'm sorry, I missed that question. Any more questions? How do we win this and remove Liberal and Labor for good? Well, the number one thing is to wake up people, Scott, educate people, share my material, because we cover our material, introduce them to my website, introduce them to my emails, get them to apply for a newsletter. That's the number one thing. We've got to wake people up. Most people are wonderful, and give them the opportunity to waken up, and they actually make the right decisions. So that's how we do it. We just awaken people, and then vote One Nation. Are we going to see anything like what's happening in the UK to come to Australia? You mean the riots, I presume? Well, Starmer's really made a mess of things, hasn't he? But how do you describe immigration in this country? Immigration in this country at the moment is atrocious, because we've got a huge number. Well, the figures from memory in the last financial year, 737,000 people were brought into this country. When you take away the people who left, we had a net increase in population of 518,000 people. For those 518,000 people, we'll need 200,000 homes to be built. We are already in a housing crisis before the year started, before the previous financial year started. Add another 200,000 homes, we are in a huge crisis. Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton both said they would reduce immigration. Well, this current year looks like it's going to be even higher than the previous one. The man who started high immigration and big Australia policy was John Howard. He doubled immigration rates from about 70 to 80,000 up to around 130 to 150,000. Doubled. And so the crisis here is about, and then subsequent Liberal governments doubled it again to around about 250, and now we're over 500,000, 518,000. So we have got to recognise that these people in the Liberal Labor parties are doing this together, similar policies, uni-party policy, and we've got to show them. We've got people in this state of ours living under bridges, sleeping in cars, in caravans, in tents, and we've got working families who are going home in the evening, man and wife going home from their jobs to look after the kids in a car. Where do they go to the toilet? Where do they go to get a shower? This is despicable. When I was up in Mackay, they took me to people sleeping on the banks of the Pioneer River, outside of town, inside of town, and working families. It just shows a complete lack of care. Yes, Wayne, no one asked you if you wanted a big Australia. Now, big Australia, I don't want a big Australia, but big Australia, let's just assume it's not a problem. I don't mind a big Australia if it's full of houses. So we've got, instead of a homeless Australia, we have a big Australia that's homed. It's disgraceful what's going on. And now it comes back to Scott's question about what's happening in the UK. The riots will happen here if there's violence. We know the perpetrator murdered those children and then innocent children, and then Starmer cracked down on people who were justifiably upset. And instead of doing something about the crime that was committed, he started belting the people who are upset and in fear. So thank you very much for listening in. We've just hit the hour mark, and I'll be back with you next week because we're going down to Canberra on Sunday. The Senate is back in session Monday to Thursday, and I will see you hopefully on Friday. So have a good weekend and enjoy yourselves and take care.